At 60 years old, most men are counting down to retirement, counting down to rest, counting down to the day the world stops asking anything of them. But one man at 60 sat alone in an empty room with four walls, a single mattress on the floor, and exactly $200 in his pocket, and decided to count up instead. Not down to the end, up toward a beginning. This is not a story about luck. It's not a story about talent or timing or some secret shortcut nobody else knew about. This is a story about a man who lost everything he had spent 40 years building and chose in the one season of life when the world tells you to give up to start again. By the end of this video, you will understand why age was never his enemy. His mind was. And once he defeated that, nothing else stood a chance. Part 1: The Fall. His name doesn't matter. What matters is what happened to him, because it could happen to any of us. For 38 years, he ran a small manufacturing business. Nothing glamorous. Metal parts, factory contracts, decades of 6-day work weeks, and missed birthdays. He built it from nothing, from a rented garage and one second-hand machine, into a company with 40 employees and a name people in his town respected. He wasn't rich, but he was stable, and stability, to a man who grew up with nothing, felt like winning. Then, in the space of 18 months, it all came apart. A larger competitor undercut his prices. A key client, one that made up 60% of his revenue, pulled out without warning. The bank, which had financed his equipment for a decade without blinking, suddenly stopped believing in him. He didn't see it coming, because when you're inside the storm, you can't see the shape of it. You just feel the walls closing in one invoice at a time. At 59, he signed the paperwork to shut the company down. At 59, he sold his house to pay what remained of the debt. At 59, he watched 38 years of work reduced to a single moving truck and a storage unit he could barely afford. His wife had passed 4 years earlier. His children were grown, living their own lives in their own cities with their own problems. He didn't tell them how bad it really was. Pride does that to a man. It convinces him that suffering in silence is somehow noble. So there he was, 60 years old, alone, broke, in a rented one-room apartment above a laundromat, listening to washing machines hum through the floor at midnight, wondering what exactly 38 years of effort had actually earned him. Some nights, he later admitted, he sat on the edge of that mattress and asked himself the question that breaks most people at that age. Is it too late for me? Part 2: The Weight of Too Late. Let's stop the story here for a moment, because this is the part that matters most. Too late is not a fact. It's a feeling, and feelings, no matter how heavy, are not evidence. Society teaches us a timeline. Build your career in your 20s. Build your family in your 30s. Build your wealth in your 40s. Coast through your 50s. Retire in your 60s. Nobody hands you a chapter titled, What to Do When Everything Collapses After 60. So when it happens, and it happens to more people than you'd think, most men don't fight. They fold. They tell themselves the story is over, that the only thing left to do is manage the decline gracefully. He almost did that too. For nearly 2 months, he did almost nothing. He applied for a few jobs, stock clerk, night security, delivery driver, and got rejected for most of them, sometimes without even a phone call back. One manager, no older than 30, looked at his resume and said, not unkindly, but bluntly, "Honestly, sir, we're looking for someone with a longer runway." A longer runway, as if his life had an expiration stamped on it that everyone else could read except him. He went home that night and did something he hadn't done in years. He cried, not from sadness alone, but from something deeper, the exhausting, humiliating feeling of being told, in so many words, that his best years were something to apologize for. And here's the truth most motivational stories skip over. He stayed in that low place for a while. He didn't bounce back the next morning with fire in his eyes. That's not how real transformation works. Real transformation doesn't start with inspiration. It starts with irritation. It starts with getting so sick of your own excuses that you'd rather risk failing again than keep sitting still. Part 3: The Turn. The turn, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning bolt, no perfect quote that fixed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting in the small public library near his apartment, not to read anything in particular, just to sit somewhere that wasn't his four walls, when he overheard two young men at the next table talking about a website they were building for a local coffee shop. He didn't understand half the words they used, but he understood the result they were describing. A small business, struggling, suddenly getting new customers because of something these two 20-something-year-olds built on a laptop in an afternoon. Something in him, some old, stubborn, entrepreneurial instinct that 38 years of running a business had carved into his bones, sat up and paid attention. He thought about all the years he'd run his own company the old way. Paper invoices, phone calls, word of mouth. He had never needed a website. He had never needed any of it. And that thought, I never needed any of it, used to be a source of pride. Now, sitting in that library with $200 to his name, it felt like the reason he'd lost everything. He didn't decide, in that moment, to reinvent himself. That's a phrase for interviews and headlines. What he actually decided was much smaller, much less impressive, and far more powerful. I'm going to learn what these two kids know. That was it. Not a 5-year plan, not a grand vision, just a decision to stop assuming the world had left him behind and start finding out what the world actually looked like now. Part 4. The humility of starting over. The next part of his story is the part nobody claps for, but it's the part that made everything else possible. He asked the librarian if he could use one of the free computers. She showed him how to open a web browser. He was 60 years old, learning to double-click a mouse from a 23-year-old librarian, and he felt every bit of the embarrassment you'd expect. But he kept showing up. Every day, for weeks, he sat at that library computer for 6, sometimes 8 hours. He watched free tutorials. He typed slower than a child learning to write. His fingers, calloused from decades of factory work, felt clumsy on a keyboard built for someone else's hands. He failed constantly. He'd follow a tutorial step by step and still end up with a broken result, with no idea why. He'd close the laptop some evenings so frustrated he wanted to walk out and never come back. But here's what separated him from most people who quit at that stage. He never once told himself he was bad at this because he was old. He told himself he was bad at this because he was new, and new things are supposed to be hard, no matter what age you learn them at. That single shift in language, from I can't because I'm too old to I can't yet because I'm new, is quite possibly the most important sentence in this entire story. Say it again, because it matters. He wasn't behind because of his age. He was behind because he was a beginner. And every expert in every field on earth was a beginner once. Some of them just happened to be beginners at 20 instead of 60. Age didn't create his disadvantage. The story he almost told himself about his age did. Part 5, Small Wins Stacked. 3 months in, he built his first website. It was ugly. Genuinely, unmistakably ugly. Mismatched fonts, a background color he later admitted looked like old mustard. But it worked. It loaded. It had text and images and a contact form that actually sent an email. He showed it to the owner of a small hardware store 2 blocks from his apartment, a man he'd gotten to know from buying supplies over the years, and offered to build him a proper website for almost nothing just to have something real in his portfolio. The hardware store owner, more out of kindness than expectation, said yes. It took him nearly a month to build what a skilled developer could finish in 2 days. But he finished it. And when the hardware store owner told him, 3 weeks later, that people were actually finding the shop through a Google search and mentioning the website when they walked in, something shifted in him permanently. It wasn't the money. There was barely any money in that first job. It was proof. Proof that his brain, at 60, could still learn something entirely new. Proof that the story he'd been told, that he had a shorter runway, was a lie built on assumption, not truth. From there, it was an instant success. Let's be honest about that, because false promises help no one. He built a second website for a local bakery for $200, then a landing page for a plumber for $350. Each project took him longer than it should have. Each one taught him something the last one hadn't. He didn't get his old life back. He built a new one that in many ways became stronger than the one he lost, because it was built by a man who had already survived losing everything once and knew, deep down, that he could survive it again if he had to. That's not luck. That's proof of what's possible when you refuse to let a number decide your future for you. Closing. So the next time you catch yourself thinking it's too late to start, too late to change, too late to try, remember the man who sat in an empty apartment at 60 years old with $200 and chose to learn something new anyway. He didn't have a longer runway. He just refused to stop taking off. If the story meant something to you, don't just scroll past it. Sit with it for a second. Because somewhere in your life, right now, there's a version of that library computer waiting for you. Some small, uncomfortable, humbling first step you keep avoiding because you've convinced yourself it's too late. It isn't. It never is.